panelists today. So if the panelists could join me on audio and video, please. I think we're waiting for one more. Right. So first, by way of introduction, so I'm Denielle Harrison. I'm a manager at BSR. And please allow me to introduce the panelists. So first, we have Hadar Borden. She's a director of the University at Buffalo's Blackstone Launchpad and Techstars, a campus-based entrepreneurship network. In addition, she also serves as the director of the Western New York Prosperity Fellowship Program, a leadership development program that seeks to recruit and retain entrepreneurial-minded students to contribute to Western New York. Next, we have John Powers. He's the president and co-founder of Clean Capital, where he leads business development, public policy, and marketing. Prior to joining Clean Capital, John led public sector business development at Bloom Energy. He also served as the first special advisor for energy to the Assistant Secretary of the Army, and also as Director of Outreach for the Army's Energy Initiatives Task Force. Another key fact is he was appointed to the post of Federal Chief Sustainability Officer by President Barack Obama. Next, we have Paul Tyno. He's the Vice President of Sustainability Technologies at NOCO Energy. Paul also serves as Program Director of Launch New York's Emerging Clean Tech Opportunity Incubator, which supports early stage companies in achieving key milestones and accelerating their time to market. So before we start our conversation, I want to invite the audience to use the Q&A function to ask questions. So you do have the ability to ask those questions anonymously, so please don't be shy. And we'll answer those questions at the end if time permits. So to kick us off, I want to acknowledge that we have some varying perspectives on this panel. So we have the entrepreneurship angle, we have the investment angle, we also have the broader business context. If each of you could talk us through how you define sustainable business and then how you think the SDGs can really help your perspective unlock value.
All right, want me to go first? I'm happy to dive in. First of all, it's hard to really define sustainable business. I think it's actually getting, 10 years ago, it was pretty easy because you would look at in terms of companies that were working in sort of in sustainability or maybe clean energy, which was a nascent industry. Now it's really becoming sort of intricate to the fabric of business as a whole. Someone once told me sustainability is like having on night vision goggles. So looking into your company and into your operations and finding ways to do things more efficiently, whether it be through waste, water, energy, supply chain logistics. So, there are so many different types of businesses that attract that. There could be software companies that help bring efficiencies to the way FedEx is delivering packages, and which is saving fuel and really cutting down carbon. There's companies like Clean Capital, which we finance and own. We have the fourth largest owner of communities, or fourth largest owner of solar in the country, commercial industrial solar. We work with big institutional investors who are investing in that space. And then you have new technologies coming forward to, whether it be for electric vehicles or microgrids. There's so much happening in this space. It's hard to truly define it. I like to think about what's happening more broadly in the market here. And actually, just last year, published a piece called "From Greta to the Boardroom," which is about for me, the unbelievable momentum that's happening in the culture change that's driving demand for things like solutions to climate change from a public perspective. And then in the boardrooms, you're having conversations because of shareholder involvement or just leadership, as Energy Mark referenced in the video, making huge renewable energy commitments, driving down carbon in their supply chains, making really strong climate plans. So, it's really hard anymore to find a sustainable business. It's more about the sustainability that's being driven across the economy as a whole.
So I would say ditto to what John said. I mean, he captured it very well. I mean, for us, it's to and then driving long-term environmental goals and natural resource gains versus really short-term objectives, right? So can we, from a corporate ethics perspective, balance the company's mission with the pillars of, people, planet, and profits? And to John's point, there are a lot of drivers out there, and companies are going to react to those drivers differently. There's social drivers, certainly are important. So family, community, employees, definitely coercive drivers play a role, and that's, maybe regulatory, maybe compliance issues. And then, as alluded to, it's market drivers, it's customers, it's revenue, it's competitors. Part of our growth plan, I think part of others, but everybody reacts to it, I think, a little bit differently.
I'll jump in from the perspective. So I work in an entrepreneurship space, encouraging and supporting our students as they create their own businesses. And I think our understanding, what we engage with every day, is that our students are purpose driven. And so we leverage that and we connect them and help them understand the sustainable development goals and really weave their purpose along with the SDGs. I think the world, as we know, needs creative entrepreneurial minds that are going in and trying to solve the biggest, most wicked problems that we have. But we have to anchor it in thinking about our people and thinking about our communities and sustainability as a whole. As we take a card from the Haudenosaunee community who lived in this space that we operate, and think about the 7 generations ahead of us. So really helping our students to connect what they've been thinking about, they're driven, but helping them understand that they can weave that into the business that they want to create and solving some of the challenges the world engages with.
Excellent. So I want to pull together a couple of points that you all made. So first, thinking about long versus short-termism. So from an organizational perspective, how can a company use the SDGs to really push towards longer-term outcomes? So thinking about purpose, and also recognizing that in this space, the SDGs, really bring together that it's both environmental and social, not forgetting the people aspect.
I'll jump in. So, for us, Danielle, I think sometimes we look at or at the end, right? So we try to define what success looks like and then work backwards from there. And when you take that kind of approach to things, it'll define those long-term objectives for you and lead you to a tactical path from a starting point to achieve those objectives, right? So it has to be a transition, and it has to move slowly, maybe. And, for someone like us, we have customers that rely on us for service in areas that ultimately don't serve the long-term goals in terms of being environmentally responsible and conscious. But yet we have an obligation to serve those customers through the transition. And so I think it means a little different thing to every type of business and where they sit in the geography and in their business acumen.
Just thinking about sustainability and climate efficiently makes you think long term. So if you look at climate planning, for instance, when I use the federal government as an example, but the Defense Department could be easily replaced in this example by UPS, right? If the federal government's laying out a strategy to build a new facility, they look at, they have to look at the climate impacts on, that facility 15 to 20 years down the road. I mean, they're going to make a massive capital investment on like a building, and, whether it be a military base or a, logistics warehouse or a hospital, you're going to want to know if, the place you're building it is expected to be flooded every 18 months, 10 years down the road, right? That type of climate planning forces long-term planning. And we're seeing this today very heavily in the insurance sector. The insurance markets recognize the risk that climate is bringing to the table and are stepping back and forcing investors to think about it as well. And that's why you have big, the president of BlackRock, for instance, who's coming out and saying, the CEO of BlackRock, they're going to be looking across their portfolio and looking at the climate metrics in terms of their investments over time, right? So as Paul said, there'll be a transition. They're invested in fossil fuels, they're invested in traditional fuels, but they're putting significant renewable money to work that is really helping folks think long term. We're going to see more and more of that developing here, I think, over the next few years. Is folks, it's no longer a debate. Climate change is real. And now the discussion is, what do we do about it? And the reality is, while there's an environmental impact, there is actually a really interesting opportunity to be made for significant money to be made in this space by driving innovation, creating new jobs, and creating a new economy based on things like clean energy. And so, that long-term thinking is going to provide actually places like Buffalo a leg up in terms of being a leader in this space.
Wholeheartedly. I think when we're thinking about our students and how they're thinking to create new products for businesses, we're constantly trying to encourage them, again, to be that proactive and really be thinking about the vitality of the business that they're building, and is it serving the community, right? So making sure that it is certainly profitable, but if you start with that philosophy of kind of being purpose-driven, then you're going to be able to take it a long way. As Paul mentioned, rather than being reactive, being proactive is the approach that we need to encourage everyone to be thinking about now as you're starting a new venture, a new organization, or rethinking something within an established organization.
For roads, for schools, for a variety of infrastructure pieces, and climate and sustainability is going to play a significant role in that. And the amount of capital that will move in this space over the next decade is I think, unlike anything we've seen before. We need to be prepared to take advantage of that opportunity here in Western New York. But from a business perspective, a lot of business leaders are looking at how they can really sort of tap into the private capital that's going to be moving into this space. I think that's one of the major macro trends that are going to really push over the next year. And the second one is we talk about environmental social good, sort of ESG. In the first quarter of 2020 had the highest ever investment in ESG to date, and it's a top of a trend that only continues to grow. This means people that are investing their money, whether it be in the stock market or private capital, private funds, pension funds, whoever, into environmental and social good investments. And Moody's actually just came out in the fall of this last year and said, look, even in the downturn of COVID, ESG investing brought significant returns and made it through its first downturn and sort of showed that it's here to stay. So you're going to have both, again, going back to that significant capital moving and looking for places to invest into opportunities that are associated with climate and sustainability. One, and then two, you're going to have a really new set of defined metrics coming out of Washington and the SEC that are going to really put a definition around that means. So we're going to, I think the idea of investing in sustainability future is not just here to stay. We're on the front end of an amazing trend and should be positioned to do more to take advantage of that.
So John, I hope with that, and I agree with you, I hope with that, though, that we don't get caught up in thinking that we have technology or technical obstacles, but really we have maybe business model challenges, right?
Totally, yeah.
We have to define the financial and the societal and the intangible benefits, and that'll help drive market animation. So we get away from science projects, with all due respect, and we move toward scalability and replication. And I think that's a pretty significant challenge in this group of stakeholders who probably haven't been around the table together before, to be around the table now to help drive this transition and to really leverage this opportunity and investment that's sitting there for us.
Yeah, Paul, I think you're 100% right. If you think of, I always use solar just as a very simple 101 example. You look at solar 10 years ago and you think about the emergence of the solar market, right? In 2008, solar was a very nascent industry, but solar panels were developed to go to the moon in the 70s, right? So the technology itself is not new. What changed in the last part of the decade was policy aligned to start to move into clean energy. You had tax incentives, and then the American Recovery Act poured a bunch of money into shovel-ready clean energy projects. And all of a sudden, they became somewhat affordable. But you also had a trained workforce who began to learn how to use them. You began to get over the business obstacles as you defined, right? People, does the sun shine enough in Buffalo to put solar panels up? Do you know what a long-term power purchase agreement looks like? And defining that to a debt market so they know what they're investing in, that just didn't make sense. 10 years later, you have wildly cheap solar panels. You have a well-trained model of a workforce and a growing workforce. It's their largest growing job in the country 2 years ago, solar installer. You have capital flowing into the sector in unbelievable numbers. And so the technologies are there. The business alignments are starting to happen. So I think about, Paul, a lot of the work you do on microgrids. Microgrid technology is there. What we don't know how to do is invest in it yet because the business models just aren't there yet. So it's not so much about the new technology. New technologies will come, and that's exciting. And I think we can really, this climate tech investing is super hot right now. But if you can't figure out the business model for it, then it's not going to really go anywhere because no CFO is going to make a decision based on the environmental impact of that investment. They're making the decision based on the green impact of the dollars.
Right. So back to uncovering value streams, right? We have to find mechanisms, I think, that allow us to quantify future value and so that we can generate investment and movement now. And that is a little bit of a challenge because there's an element of speculation, there's a leap of faith, and a lot of things in terms that might be scary or imposing to those on the investment side of the house.
Yeah. Denielle, we hijacked your conversation, sorry.
No, I appreciate you putting the conversation forward as we manage that technical issue. But I do want to follow up on that point. So there are two key challenges as we think about the SGDs and we think about climate in particular. So one is really thinking about, so you mentioned business models. So one question for us to, we can punt on is really how do companies, organizations really make that change? So thinking long term to shift their business model so that we can, as a society, be more sustainable. And another part, so thinking about challenges on climate in particular, we don't really have the infrastructure to be able to do a lot of this stuff at scale. How can we leverage some of the current and future investment flows to really be able to really make a significant impact on the infrastructure and really build out what we need to really support our ambitions?
I'll jump in on your first question in terms of how do we retool. And I think, again, working with college students that are constantly driving creativity and innovation and are constantly inspiring me, I think engaging everyone in the conversation and reaching into higher education for people that are thinking a little bit differently than all of us. So infusing in kind of the traditional organizations, some forward-thinking, progressive movement, and encouraging every voice at the table. I think in our last panel, there was a focus on people, right? And so making sure that everyone has a voice and a space at the table, that'll inform the companies that we build and we retool.
I also think we need to be thinking about honestly, the 21st century economy as a whole. So here in Western New York, there's been a really amazing push around innovation with things like 43 North and the governor's push in this space. You have to test the plan, of course, but who would have bet that an auto auctioning software like ACV Auctions would become $1 billion company here in Western New York, which is super exciting. Those bets are being made every day in Silicon Valley. They're being made all the time. So there's really creativity coming out of entrepreneurs there. And I think here, especially locally, we have to be open to looking at some of those transformational pushes into new business models and figuring out how to invest in them and support them. And then to get to your second, for me, Daniel, the second point is super important, which is the infrastructure point. So, the electric vehicles, for instance, the electric vehicle market is could not be any hotter than it is right now, which is exciting. So, the push around infrastructure that the president is doing today is ensuring that we have in place the infrastructure to support that expected growth. It shouldn't be lost on anybody that there's a GM that's running the Will Ferrell ads right now about electric vehicles in Norway. Like they were not saying that 2 years ago in a different administration. They see the potential and the investment that's coming, and we just have to candidly think to be on the front end of those trends here, so we can invest appropriately and support the infrastructure build out. One thing Ryan and I talked about ahead of this conference is, one of my challenges to just us here in Western New York is we don't hear about that conversation enough. You don't hear our civic leaders talking about the fact that there's going to be a unbelievable amount of capital moving here in the next 18 months, and how do we invest sustainably here and rebuild our infrastructure? A city that was really built in the late 1800s. We've got to really think through how to have a more sustainable infrastructure here in Western New York to support those type of companies and those type of opportunities.
Drill down into, so Paul, you can answer if you have something to say.
Real quick, I think there's a couple aspects here to consider. We have to be doing projects and demonstrations and funding opportunities as endpoints or specific projects, right? Because then they function in a very siloed, detached fashion. They should all be looked at as continuations. So what do I mean by that? It's very hard to sit at a high enough elevation to view these different activities, some driven by NYSERDA, some by regulation and policy. It's very difficult to sit high enough to see how they should all fit together and work as a part of a whole. And I know that's very high level and very conceptual, but we've got some significant advantages in having an authority like NYSERDA in the state. We've got money that all of us through different projects, grants, and so on have leveraged through the years to drive activity. But rarely do we take that project and wring a little bit more out of it as a continuation. So we might look at storage attached to a building, but we don't see how that building fits into the scheme of a microgrid. And we don't see how a collection of buildings might in turn then provide a service to the grid as opposed to traditional generation resources. That's just an example. And that's a big challenge. If we can put those pieces together and think a little bit differently and not presuppose outcomes, then you'll see a lot of, in my opinion, market engagement, and that drives market animation, and that'll really start to move the needle. So I've said this, many of you that are on the call and in the audience, we know each other. You've heard me say this a bunch of times, but we have to have the market at the table, and we have to work at the pace of business, because that will, and we can't continue the conversation with just a limited group of stakeholders.
Yeah, Paul, I think one of the most exciting facts for me, Paul, in terms of the opportunity to address climate change, to keep us under 2 degrees Celsius, which many people sort of see as a huge threshold. It's going to take us $1 trillion in annual investment in this space. We are just for the first time ever crest 500 billion last year. But the trends were very slow. They weren't slow, but they were slower, and now they're continuing to skyrocket up. So you're right. I mean, if we think in incremental steps of pilot after pilot after pilot, no one's going to unleash hundreds of millions of dollars into those type of pilots, right? We need to be thinking significantly larger than that, and how to basically take those pilots and then just amplify them. So, which I would argue is not really done super well at the policy level here in New York. But
so speaking about being local, so thinking about Buffalo, what can Buffalo do to really increase its readiness? So thinking about becoming more sustainable for the future, what can be done from a tangible perspective to make sure, again, to Paul's point, not being incremental but not making long-term progress? what really should be done. And another aspect of that question is really thinking about people. So does Buffalo have the human capital? Do you have the talent to be able to really help you meet the moment as you grow and progress?
Yes and yes. I think we have the talent. I think my view on this is we should be pushing to take the Rust Belt and turn it into the Green Belt. The opportunity here for not this is no longer a question of are these jobs here to stay. It's a question of who's going to get them first. And we need to position ourselves here in Western New York to be in the front end of that. The Tesla plant, for all its challenges, was really a great starting point of that. But, you know, I remember back in the day here, we used to get so excited because what's the name of the hunting fishing store they were going to bring into town? What was the big hunting and fishing?
Bass Pro.
Yeah, Bass Pro was going to be like the economic savior of Buffalo like 10 years ago, right? Now there's a ton of different things happening here, and exciting things happening at many different levels. And clean energy and sustainability can really tie those together if we invest appropriately here to continue to bring those jobs. We have the workforce. My generation is coming home. I lived for 20 years in DC. There's expats all over the country looking to come home. The first thing they do is open the Buffalo News when they get to work and follow the Bills religiously on Twitter. They want to come home to Western New York. They got skill sets to do what they want to do. We just have to give them the opportunities to come back here.
And again, I would say from the higher education perspective, we've got 21 colleges and universities that all bring in human capital into the region. And so as we look to build the Greenbelt in Western New York, we need to really leverage and lean on our higher education institutions. We need to create spaces where our students are mentored and feel a sense of belonging and have this loyalty and affinity to the region, whether it's the Bills or through walking the streets with an organization like Explore Buffalo and really understanding the history and the culture and celebrating our community. I think we have what it takes to really be that green belt and invite people to be part of the conversation from all parts of our community.
Yeah, and you know what I think is exciting about and this is wearing my NOCO hat, this is wearing my Launch New York hat, this is just being, you know, born and raised and here my entire life, is we've got such a fascinating blend of committed people, and we've got folks from different generations. We have, dare I say, delightfully vintage people like myself. We have people coming back, expats, as John alluded to, coming back to the region for all the right reasons. We have a younger generation that I see every day at Launch New York and through the Eco Incubator. And we do these onboarding calls and we listen to these entrepreneurs. And truth be told, I sit there and I say, okay, I'm not sure about this idea. I'm not sure from the abstract that there's something there. And then I listen to this person and it drives me to look through a different lens and have a different perspective. And it's bringing all that together, sort of that energy in Western New York that's going to make a difference. We need to leverage our rich history and our human resources that I think we have in abundance to make a difference. And I definitely think there's challenges in the lower part of the state, in the city, in Long Island, and Hudson Valley that are different from the challenges and opportunities from upstate. And I honestly believe the state is looking for someone to defeat the blank page and show them and demonstrate how this works. And I think that's the opportunity for Western New York, to take all these divergent thoughts, projects, and experiences and demonstrate why this is the area that they should focus on.
And Paul, I think if we learned anything over this last year and a half is you don't have to be in Manhattan or in San Francisco or in a place like Austin to tap into this, right? I mean, I will be traveling back to New York pretty regularly again for work, but I've been able to stay connected to folks all across the country. As a matter of fact, a lot of my friends who lived in Silicon Valley left. They took the chance to go to Boise. They took the chance to go to Denver. They took the chance to come back to Buffalo because they didn't want to be spending exorbitant amount of money on a house and sitting in their house on Zoom all day.
Right.
So, we should try to capitalize on that opportunity. I would argue one thing we don't do well here in Buffalo is go out and market.
Mhm.
We need to get back. We need a roadshow that tells our story to start to attract that capital back here to Western New York and the people.
Great.
I'm volunteering Ryan to drive that. He doesn't know that.
So I want to answer some of the questions in our chat. So if profit is the driver of corporate action, how do we ensure that our nation's transition to clean energy is equitable? Are we at risk of entrenching existing inequalities in power structures?
Yes, we're at a risk of it. I think you're seeing significant climate and environmental justice efforts come out of this new administration that is going to force things like, so let's look at community solar, for example. If I want to do a community solar project, meaning I build a solar plant in Batavia. I mean, I live in Elmwood Village. I buy my power from a solar plant in Batavia. For that to get financed, I need to go to the tax equity market who wants to ensure that a person like, that is able to pay their electricity bill for sure is on that offtake. So how do you then build in the mechanisms to ensure that LMI communities have access to that and maybe put in backstops, for instance, like the loan guarantee program by the Department of Energy, or the NYSERDA could have some type of buffer. The reality is people are paying their electricity bills and that ends up getting taken care of, but we just have to ensure that community is at the table and thought through it. It has not been, honestly, in the growth of the industry. We can be blunt about it. But there's great, but that community is now being engaged in a new way, I believe. And you have organizations like Grid Alternatives, for instance, who go into these communities and help folks join the booming clean energy workforce. It's something that needs to be in the front of mind for all of us that care about climate justice.
A follow-up question to that in the chat is thinking about renewables in particular. So a big pushback on renewables, really thinking about reliability and cost. So the question is, what can we do to really remedy some of these concerns?
And they're valid concerns, right? And we have to be careful.
Are they valid?
I'm sorry?
Are they valid? I don't think they're valid.
Well,
anymore.
No, I think they're valid from the standpoint that I think we have to be careful who actually shoulders the burden of regulation and policy, right? So again, not so much to the technical challenge, because there are offsets to intermittency. There are ways to address that sort of concern and the need to not have that sort of problem on the system. But I think we have to be careful who actually shoulders the burden of that regulation and policy and that cost, right? So it's a tough line to walk, right? We can't drive climate policy and change at the expense of economic development. We have to do it responsibly. I believe we can do it responsibly, but it's going to take a collective effort, and it's going to take the willingness to think differently and try things in a different fashion.
I'd argue that it's the perception that's the hardest part. The cost is not an issue anymore. Here in Western New York, we have cheap hydropower, so it's harder to do renewables. Nationwide, renewables are blowing away natural gas, coal in ways no one expected 10 years ago. The cost is continuing to drive down. The efficiencies are there. Tax incentives have worked. The reliability question, really, the technologies are coming. Storage, Paul's done a lot of microgrid work. Like, the technologies are coming. But let's look at Texas for a second. It wasn't renewables that shut down the Texas grid.
Right.
It wasn't renewables, right? That was terrible policy. The ERCOT system was completely structured to get to the bottom, cheapest piece of capital. So why did their windmills freeze? Because they didn't invest in them. But their coal plants freeze. Their natural gas plants broke down. Their microgrid and the transmission systems didn't work. That wasn't because of wind and solar. But they created a perception afterwards on places like Fox News that pushed that. So we as an industry need to counter that perception and show that, like, renewables. Apple built their new headquarters in Silicon Valley. It's 175 acres. It's 100% renewable, and it's completely off the grid. That is their operational headquarters. The technology is there. They probably paid a little bit of a premium to do it, no doubt about it. But there's ways of doing it. It's getting cheaper and cheaper by the day.
Another question from the chat, I think this one is for you, Hadar. So thoughts about educational institutions embedding the SDGs into their core curriculums across all majors. So recognizing that they're embedded in some like architecture, but they're missing from areas like business.
Well, thanks so much for that question. So agreed. Education is a tough one sometimes. It takes time for it to change and respond. I think, as I keep on saying, our students are the ones that really demand it, but also people like myself, faculty are constantly pushing, and there's different ways of doing it. There's in curriculum, but there's also in co-curricular experiences. So one of the things that we've done on our campus, at least in our entrepreneurship center, is that we're again using the SDGs as a framework to engage students in the conversation. So we're making sure that it's part of the rhetoric that they see both in the classroom and outside of the classroom. And we are trying to encourage more change in the classroom, and hopefully all leading to what I call as sustainable development literate graduates. But I think I encourage our business leaders that are here in this conference to tell higher education institutions that this matters to you, that you want employees that care about the SDGs, and that will make higher education respond as well. So it's a partnership. It's not just one end, but it's really a collaboration.
Excellent point. We've got another question here in the chat. So this goes back to our point, really thinking about how do you innovate on your business model to really take action on climate and the SDGs more broadly. The question is really, is there a best practice example that you can point the audience to in terms of a company that's doing well on some of these topics?
Can I just point to NOCO for a second? This is a company. No, seriously, I'm 100% serious. This is a company that has its history is fossil fuel, right? And here the leadership saw the potential to transition into the clean economy, and they're doing just that. And locally, I think that's there's a long multiple decades worth history there. Energy Mark, who's obviously one of our sponsors, is doing really Clean Capital is doing amazing stuff. I'm just going to point that out. But there are a lot of companies that are thinking innovatively, have pivoted to take advantage of the clean economy, and are honestly just making buttloads of money off of it, which isn't a bad problem. It's actually a very positive thing. They see the market, they're moving in the market, and they're finding ways to be profitable doing it.
And I think, Danielle, it's everybody's going to be motivated a little bit different. Like we're driven to be a fourth generation company, third now. That fourth generation is at the doorstep. That's our motivation. And it would have been very easy to just button it up at this stage for the company and say, hey, that was a great run. But, there's that desire to leave more in the community. And a lot of it is internal motivation. We have a boatload of employees. And then if you multiply the members of their family, that rely on companies like us and others in Western New York to drive forward, to change, to pivot, and to be part of energy of the future. It's a significant opportunity, and it's something that we're motivated by. And I know others in the space, whether they're in a competitor or not, are motivated by the same thing. And I think it's interesting because, as opportunities present themselves financially, as maybe policy drives a market opportunity, you tend to see a lot of outside the area companies sort of parachute in, try to leverage that business opportunity, and then they're gone. And many of us on this call, on this panel, and part of the roundtable as a whole have been here for a long time. and we're vested in our community. And, we're active, we're on nonprofit boards, we're giving back in many different ways, well, it's philanthropic or otherwise. And that's the foundation that we have here in Western New York. And kind of back to the earlier question about why I'm convinced that we're going to succeed.
There's also there's companies that really, like NOCO is an example. Gibraltar, a company that grew out of Buffalo, they're investing in solar technology. They're a steel company. They're investing in solar technologies all around the country. Stark Technologies is a local company that was AT&T's Sustainability Partner of the Year 2 years ago because of the work they're doing. I mean, we have a really good track record here for opportunity in the sustainability space. And I think the thing I love about this conference is that the focus continues to be here. And I think we need to do more, honestly, to get our leadership committed to that, because we should be really continuing to sort of raise the stories up of what's going on here. Wendell, an amazing firm based in Williamsville, works internationally, doing incredible sustainability work. But we need to be telling those stories.
And Denielle, I had the fortune and still am actively involved in a project on the Buffalo Niagara Medical Campus. That's a storage project. And it's tied to the Houtman Woodward Medical Research Institute. And it's got a scientifically driven, and it's economic development driven, and it's created jobs, and it's got a pretty interesting energy component tied to storage. And to John's point, when we convened the group and we did a scoping of assessment of, hey, what kind of partners and technologies do we need to get to that success beacon, I found every single one of those partners here in Western New York. So it wasn't an effort to keep it local. It just made sense for it to be local because we had those groups here in Western New York. And they weren't a stretch. They were cutting edge. And John mentioned a couple of them. And there's others here in the area that we're all alert to in the storage area, whether it's building automation, hardware, software. And again, I think to his point, we don't necessarily do enough to promote the assets that reside here already.
That's a great point. And I'd love to hear from each of you. So recognizing the work that needs to be done, what advice would you give to companies if they feel like their leadership or their organization overall is a little bit hesitant to really act on sustainability, recognizing the great potential, especially for the Buffalo area? What words of wisdom or advice would you give to them?
So I think it can be stick or carrot, right? And give me a little room here. I think people feel like there's a lot of complexity to what we're talking about. And I'm talking about smaller businesses, mid-size, maybe emerging businesses that they're motivated to sustainable activities. They want to leverage energy efficiency, and they get all fired up when we have the conversation, and then tomorrow comes and they don't know what to do. And I think there's fear of that complexity. And the reality of it is, it doesn't have to be complex. They're likely taking very simple steps now that are sustainable activities. So I think it's a matter of keeping it simple, finding your internal champion, maybe bringing people into a work council that don't necessarily share the same view and getting them engaged. The stick side of it a little bit is that markets are changing, right? And I've got some of these stats from a presentation that Ryan did, so kudos to Ryan. But 46% of tomorrow's stakeholders value sustainability, 31% boycott unsustainable companies, and 40% cite climate change as the biggest challenge. So really, how do your efforts measure up against those impacts? That's kind of the stick piece. In other words, you're going to have to respond to your customers, to your employees, to your bank, to your investors. And that is going to motivate some action as well. So again, I think it's keep it simple. Sometimes simplicity is the ultimate sophistication, right? And momentum can be very powerful. So get something going.
Go ahead.
I'll just jump in and say that I would say be stubbornly optimistic and patient, but you know that Ryan knows this about me. I'm very optimistic. I think I always turn to the lifeblood of an organization, and what Paul said is thinking just the small steps, maybe taking one challenge and turning it into what I would call a sustainability sprint within the company, but partnering with a higher education institution and bringing in students that can look at a sector within your company and give you some fresh ideas. So you're not only engaging the people within the organization that have kind of that institutional knowledge and the industry knowledge, but also bringing fresh, young, creative, innovative, like hungry minds to demonstrate some of their thinking and infuse some new ideas. But again, it doesn't have to be the whole organization, but just one area. And maybe you challenge it's a sustainability sprint every quarter or maybe once a year. And that's a way to encourage leadership to join on board with you.
That's a good example. I like to think of the macros and the micros. The macros are, it obviously depends on what your company does, but take the time to step back and really show the leadership about the trends that are happening. The trends are moving. I mean, either you at this point you're either getting on board with it or you're going to miss the opportunity because your competitors are going to beat you to it. And then showing those trends and the opportunities to get involved financially. And then second, from a micro perspective, and this is both of you guys have raised examples of creating in essence a sustainability working group within your. If you don't have the culture for it, try to create a small group. You're going to find a lot of other like-minded people that want to do this at your company. But the only thing I would say is don't make it about the environmental impact. Make it about the economic impact, and that's how you're going to get the CFO and others on board. The environmental impact is going to follow. But if you're leading with the environmental impact, you may not get the response you want from like the C-suite. If you lead on the economic impact with, hey, look, if we eliminate waste from this part of a logistics stream, it's going to save us this much money. That is a no-brainer, whether you care about the environmental impact or not. I think that's where the opportunities are today in sustainability, because your competitors are moving in that direction, the market's moving in that direction. And if you want to play in the 21st economy, you really need to be thinking that way.
And it brings me to one final question from the chat about playing in the 21st century. So thinking about policy positions. So there's a lot of push from the Gen Z and millennials to really take a stand for companies. So on a topic broadly on sustainability, considering both environmental and social aspects, should companies be doing this? Should they be taking that stand?
Yes. Yes.
Simply yes, but follow the statement with an action, right?
Totally.
Kind of an easy yes, but again, I think coming from the market, coming from business, I think has a meaningful impact and will be the driver.
If you think about when President Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, oh, sorry.
When President Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, which obviously many of us here don't agree with that decision, hundreds of companies signed on, and regardless of what they were saying, and I think the impact of that message was incredibly powerful. But the thing we've got to be careful of is greenwashing, and making sure that as I think both everyone else has said, like there needs to be action to match those words, and it's really important that we push people in that direction.
I think one thing just to tie everything together, so that the question about how do you really, if your company is not necessarily bought in on sustainability just yet, how do you bring them there? I think it's all about internally education. So showing the opportunities, so showing the economic value, like John mentioned. And I'd say the same thing as well for public policy, really thinking about where the company can have a true impact and really being able to follow through. So not just, I mean, we're seeing a lot of this with, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that was the topic in the prior session. But, a lot of companies have come out making strong statements, but, people are kind of waiting, where's the rest of it? Where's the action? And I'd say that'd be exactly the same thing for sustainability. And I think a topic like climate in particular, we're definitely gonna, that's one of my last questions that we have a few minutes left is really thinking, so the US now has a greenhouse gas emissions reduction target to reduce emissions 50% by 2030. And I think that could be another play from the policy perspective. Again, going back to the point on infrastructure, we can't get there if we don't have the right systems in place to really push forward.
Couldn't agree more. The next 10 years in this space are going to be transformational, and whoever's making the moves the next couple of years are going to be the leaders in it. And if you don't get on that train, you're going to miss the opportunity.
Yeah, agree.
Absolutely. So I guess with that, let's wrap up. So I have my talking points here. Well, thank you, first of all, for all of you for joining us for this great session. It's been a really rich discussion, and I'm glad we were able to answer so many of the audience questions. So if we were in person, we would have given you chocolate and flowers, all sustainable, of course. But in lieu of this, since we're virtual, SBR will be making a donation on your behalf, and SBR's executive director will be following up with you on this shortly. So happy hour to everyone. So the happy hour run through about 5:30 today, and the discussion prompts as a follow-up to this session are, what are the opportunities related to the SDGs for your organization? And 2, what are the action items you take away from this year's summit? So big picture from all of the sessions. And presentation mode will start again shortly, so you'll get a chance to hear from some of the 2021 Recognition Award winners. Be prepared to be inspired and entertained. And SBR will also announce the second winner of VIP tickets to Borderland Festival. So stay tuned, and thank you.
Great job, Danielle.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
That was fun. Thanks, Danielle.